The first sign that something tiny was living around Ethan Cole's camp wasn't a sound. It was a footprint. The morning wind drifted across the pale silver plains of Kepler 442c, carrying thin dust that glittered under the rising sun like powdered glass. Ethan Cole knelt beside the landing strut of his survey shuttle, tightening a loose panel with a small wrench, when his eyes caught something strange along the smooth surface of the metal. A row of prints, perfectly shaped, perfectly spaced, and impossibly small. Each one was no larger than the tip of his little finger. Ethan leaned closer, squinting beneath the brim of his faded field cap. The prints crossed the dust-covered hull, continued down the ramp, and disappeared into the fine gray soil outside the ship. "That's new," he muttered quietly. His voice sounded oddly loud in the wide-open silence. Kepler 442c wasn't supposed to have intelligent life. According to the survey charts, the planet held breathable air, scattered forests of bioluminescent plants, and mild gravity just under Earth standard, about 0.93 g, but nothing resembling civilization. Certainly nothing leaving footprints that looked suspiciously like tiny bare feet. Ethan stood up slowly, brushing dust from his work gloves. The early sunlight stretched long amber shadows across the valley, reflecting off the low hills and strange crystalline trees that hummed faintly in the wind. Somewhere far away, a flock of winged creatures drifted across the sky like paper kites. Otherwise, the planet was quiet. Too quiet. His boots crunched lightly over the dry soil as he followed the trail. The prints zigzagged across the ground in uneven lines, sometimes close together, sometimes spaced as if the tiny owner had been running. The path led around a supply crate, past the portable generator, and stopped beside a half-empty energy bar wrapper Ethan had tossed aside the night before. The wrapper had been opened again. Not torn. Opened. Ethan crouched, turning the foil between his fingers. A small bite mark showed along the edge, neat and careful, like someone nibbling cautiously at unfamiliar food. He felt a strange mixture of confusion and curiosity tug at him. "Okay," he said softly to the empty air. "Either I'm going crazy, or I've got a neighbor." The breeze shifted, rustling through the glowing leaves of a nearby plant. Ethan straightened and looked around the campsite. At first he saw nothing unusual, just the same quiet landscape, the same scattered equipment, the same lonely valley stretching for miles in every direction. Then he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it. Pip, pip, pip. Ethan froze. The noise came from somewhere low to the ground, hidden beneath the shadow of a small rock formation near the base of a luminescent shrub. It wasn't mechanical. It sounded hesitant, like someone trying to get his attention without being noticed. Ethan slowly lowered himself to one knee, careful not to move too quickly. "Hey," he said gently, keeping his voice calm. "I hear you." Silence followed. The wind whispered across the valley again. Ethan waited. Then the tiny sound returned, softer this time. Pip. A pair of glowing blue eyes suddenly peeked out from the darkness beneath the rock. Ethan blinked in disbelief. Staring back at him was the smallest person he had ever seen, no taller than 3 inches, with delicate translucent wings folded behind her back and skin the color of soft twilight blue. The miniature alien girl clutched a crumb of his energy bar in both hands. Her eyes widened when she realized he had spotted her, and in a trembling voice no louder than a whisper carried by the wind, she said, "Please, don't eat me." For a moment Ethan Cole simply stared, convinced that the long weeks alone on Kepler 442c had finally started playing tricks on his mind. The tiny girl beneath the rock trembled like a leaf in the wind, clutching the crumb of energy bar as if it were the only shield she had left in the universe. Her wings folded tighter against her back, and her glowing blue eyes stayed fixed on him with pure, terrified certainty. Ethan slowly blinked once, then twice, making sure the figure did not disappear. She did not. He exhaled a quiet breath through his nose and leaned back slightly, so that his shadow no longer covered the rock. The movement alone seemed to startle her. She gasped softly and tried to step backward, but the crumb in her hand slowed her down. Ethan raised both palms carefully in front of him, the universal gesture for peace that every spacefaring culture seemed to understand sooner or later. "Hey now," he said in a calm voice that carried gently through the still air. "Easy. I am not going to eat you." The little alien girl froze. Her wings twitched once. She clearly understood the words, or at least the tone behind them. Her small voice came again, shaking like a loose wire in the wind. All humans eat smaller species. That is what the stories say. Ethan tilted his head slightly at that. Well, he replied slowly. Whoever told those stories did not know many humans. The girl stared at him, clearly uncertain whether to believe anything he said. Up close, Ethan could see more details now. Her skin shimmered with faint patterns that shifted like moonlight on water. Her hair flowed behind her shoulders in strands the color of pale starlight, and her wings looked almost like glass, thin and delicate with faint glowing veins running through them. She was tiny, yes, but there was nothing fragile about the intelligence in her eyes. She was watching him carefully, measuring every breath he took. Ethan glanced down at the crumb she was holding. You found my snack, he said with a soft chuckle. The girl looked down at it, then back up at him, as if realizing she had been caught stealing something sacred. I was testing it, she said quickly, to see if it was poison before you used it to trap me. Ethan could not help smiling a little at that. It is peanut butter and oats, he explained. Trust me, it is barely dangerous to humans. The tiny girl did not smile back. Instead, she slowly lifted the crumb and took the smallest bite imaginable, chewing cautiously while never looking away from him. Ethan stayed perfectly still. He knew that sudden movement would only make things worse. The wind drifted through the valley again, carrying the faint humming sound of the crystal trees. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan reached slowly into the side pocket of his field jacket and pulled out another energy bar. The alien girl immediately stepped backward, wings spreading slightly in alarm. Ethan stopped moving. Relax, he said softly. He broke off a small piece, no bigger than a pebble, and gently placed it on the ground several inches away from her hiding place. Then he leaned back and rested his elbows on his knees. There, he said. If I wanted to eat you, I would not be sharing my lunch. The girl stared at the new piece of food as if it were a mysterious artifact. Her eyes moved between the crumb and Ethan's face again and again. Slowly, carefully, she stepped forward. Every movement was cautious, like someone approaching a creature they had always believed was a monster. Ethan remained still, patient as a stone in the sun. The little alien reached the crumb and lifted it with both hands. She hesitated, studying him once more. Then she whispered something so quiet that Ethan barely heard it. You are not acting like the stories. Ethan gave a small shrug. Stories usually get things wrong. For the first time since he had noticed the tiny footprints that morning, the girl's expression shifted from fear to something else. Confusion, and perhaps the smallest spark of curiosity. The tiny alien girl stood on the dusty ground beside the rock, both hands wrapped around the crumb Ethan had given her, staring up at the giant human as if she was still trying to decide whether he was real or simply a strange dream. Ethan remained exactly where he was, resting on one knee beside the landing ramp of his shuttle, careful not to move too quickly. He had worked around enough wildlife on frontier planets to understand that patience was the difference between trust and panic. The sun continued rising over the valley, turning the silver soil into a field of warm copper light, and the crystalline trees nearby hummed softly in the breeze like distant wind chimes. The tiny girl finally took another small bite of the crumb and chewed slowly. Her wings relaxed just a little. What is your designation? She asked cautiously. Ethan blinked. My designation, he repeated with a faint smile. You mean my name? She hesitated. Yes, your name. Ethan tapped his chest lightly with one gloved finger. Ethan Cole. I am from Earth. The girl studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly as if storing the information somewhere important. Ethan Cole, she repeated carefully, making sure the words came out correctly. Then she placed one hand over her own chest. My name is Luma. Ethan nodded in return. Nice to meet you, Luma. The name seemed to calm her slightly. She took a few small steps forward, still keeping a cautious distance between them. Now that the fear in her eyes had softened, Ethan could see just how small she truly was. Standing upright, she barely reached the height of his thumb. Her wings shimmered faintly as they adjusted in the warm air. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Luma looked up again and asked the question that had clearly been sitting in her mind the entire time. If humans do not eat smaller beings, she said slowly, then why did you place food outside your shelter? Ethan followed her gaze toward the wrapper near the supply crate and chuckled quietly. Honestly, I dropped it. Luma tilted her head. Dropped it? Yes, Ethan said. Humans make mistakes. Especially before morning coffee. The explanation clearly confused her. She glanced back at the crumb in her hands again, as if the idea that food could simply appear by accident challenged everything she knew. On my world, she said carefully, nothing valuable is ever dropped. Ethan shrugged lightly. Well, Earth is full of dropped things. Luma looked around the campsite for the first time with curiosity instead of fear. The portable generator hummed quietly beside the shuttle. The metal crates reflected the morning light. A row of survey sensors blinked softly as they collected atmospheric data. To her, the entire place must have looked like the territory of a giant creature. This is your territory? She asked. Not really, Ethan replied. Just a temporary camp while I study the planet. Luma seemed surprised again. You study worlds that are not yours. Ethan nodded. That is part of the job. She stared at him for a long moment. Humans are very strange. Ethan laughed softly at that. You are not the first alien to say that. The breeze shifted again, carrying the scent of glowing pollen through the valley. Luma lifted her head slightly, as if sensing something in the air. Her wings fluttered once, reflecting the sunlight in delicate flashes of blue and silver. She looked back at Ethan, still uncertain but no longer terrified. The stories about humans say you conquer every place you visit, she said quietly. Ethan glanced across the peaceful valley stretching far beyond his camp, and then back down at the tiny girl standing in the dust beside his boot. His voice softened when he answered. Sometimes humans explore because we want to understand the universe, he said, not because we want to own it. Luma studied his face carefully, searching for deception, but all she found was calm honesty. For the first time since she had revealed herself beneath the rock, she stepped 1 inch closer to him. The distance between them was still enormous, but the meaning behind the movement was clear. Trust, even the smallest amount, had begun to grow. The valley grew brighter as the sun climbed higher above the distant crystal ridges, painting long waves of gold across the pale silver soil. Ethan Cole slowly shifted his weight so he could sit more comfortably beside the landing ramp of his survey shuttle, careful to move slowly enough that the tiny alien girl would not startle again. Luma watched every motion with focused attention, her luminous blue eyes following his hands as if each finger belonged to a creature capable of sudden and mysterious change. From her perspective, Ethan must have looked like a living mountain. His boots alone were taller than the crystalline shrub she had first hidden beneath. Yet he had not moved toward her, had not reached for her, had not done anything the frightening human legends had promised. Instead, he had shared food. The idea still seemed to puzzle her. Luma finished the crumb she was holding and brushed a few remaining flakes from her small hands. She looked up again, studying Ethan's face as if searching for signs that the kindness had been some sort of trick. You remain very still, she observed carefully. Ethan smiled slightly. I figured that helps. Helps what? She asked. Helps you not think I am about to grab you. Luma glanced at his hands again, then nodded slowly. Yes, that does help. Ethan reached for his canteen beside the ramp and took a slow drink of water before placing it back down. Even that simple movement made Luma shift her stance, wings fluttering once in alert curiosity. She seemed to be constantly measuring his scale against her own world. After a moment, Ethan said, You know, if you are going to stay near the camp, there is something I could build for you. Luma tilted her head. Build. Ethan pointed toward the metal supply crate nearby. Shelter. Something safer than a rock. The wind out here gets stronger later in the day. Luma turned to look across the valley. The breeze had already begun to pick up slightly, stirring the glowing leaves of the crystal trees so that they hummed in gentle musical tones. She wrapped her arms around herself instinctively, as if remembering colder nights. My people travel, she said quietly. We do not stay long in one place. Ethan nodded. Fair enough. But traveling is easier when you have somewhere safe to rest first. Luma looked back at him. Her wings shifted thoughtfully. You would build shelter for a being you just met? She asked. Ethan shrugged in the relaxed way humans often did when kindness seemed obvious. Sure. Luma stared at him again, clearly struggling with the logic. You are not gaining anything from this, she said slowly. Humans usually expect trade. Ethan thought about that for a moment, and then smiled faintly. Sometimes we just like helping. The words hung in the warm air between them. Luma seemed unsure how to respond. After a long pause, she walked a few careful steps closer to the edge of Ethan's boot, still keeping several inches of space between them. From Ethan's perspective, she looked like a tiny glowing figure walking across the dusty surface of an alien world that suddenly felt a little less lonely. Luma folded her wings behind her again and looked up at him with open curiosity now instead of fear. "If you build this shelter," she said thoughtfully, "it will be the first human structure my people have ever stood inside." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That is quite an honor." Luma nodded once. "Or a great mistake," she added honestly. Ethan chuckled softly at that. "Well," he said, glancing toward his scattered equipment and tools, "I guess we will find out together." The valley wind carried another quiet musical hum through the glowing trees as the strange partnership between a human explorer and a tiny alien traveler slowly began to take shape under the rising alien sun. The sun had climbed nearly halfway across the sky by the time Ethan Cole finally stood up from his spot beside the landing ramp. The long, quiet valley around the shuttle had warmed under the alien sunlight, and the silver dust now carried faint ripples of heat that shimmered like distant water. Luma watched the giant human carefully as he rose to his full height, her wings tightening slightly behind her back. Even though she had already spoken with him for several minutes, the scale difference still felt overwhelming. From her perspective, the movement was like watching a mountain stand up. Ethan stretched his shoulders once and then looked down toward the tiny glowing figure near his boot. "All right," he said calmly. "Let us see what we can build." Luma followed his gaze toward the supply crates scattered across the camp. Each crate was taller than a house from her point of view. She tilted her head thoughtfully. "Your tools are enormous," she said. Ethan chuckled softly. "Yes, that is a problem I had not fully considered." He crouched again near the crate and slowly opened one of the smaller utility compartments. Inside were spare circuit panels, folded sensor frames, and a roll of flexible thermal foil used for emergency insulation. Ethan studied the materials for a moment, then carefully pulled out a thin metal bracket no longer than 6 inches. In his hand it looked insignificant. Next to Luma, it would become an entire wall. He placed the bracket gently on the ground several inches away from her, so she could see it without feeling threatened. "How about something like this?" he asked. Luma approached the piece of metal cautiously, walking along its edge while examining the smooth, reflective surface. The bracket rose above her like a curved silver cliff. She placed one small hand against it, testing the material. "Strong," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "Titanium alloy. Very strong." Luma stepped back and studied the piece again. Her wings fluttered once as she imagined the possibilities. "You could make many walls with pieces like this," she said. "That is the idea," Ethan replied. He reached into the crate again and pulled out a strip of transparent sensor shielding, a flexible material that bent easily but resisted wind and moisture. When he placed it beside the metal bracket, the two objects together began to resemble the frame of a small shelter. Luma watched the process with growing fascination. Her fear had not vanished completely, but curiosity was now clearly winning the quiet battle inside her mind. Ethan worked slowly, cutting the shielding with a small multi-tool and bending the bracket just enough to create a simple triangular structure. Each motion was careful and deliberate. Luma noticed that he always placed the pieces on the ground rather than handing them directly toward her. The giant human seemed very aware of how easily his size could frighten someone smaller. After several minutes, the rough shape of a tiny shelter stood on the dusty ground. It was no taller than 4 inches, but the angled metal sides blocked the wind, and the clear shield above allowed sunlight to pass through. Ethan leaned back slightly and examined the structure. "Not exactly a luxury home," he admitted, "but it should survive the afternoon wind." Luma slowly walked toward the entrance of the little shelter. The opening was just large enough for her wings to fold comfortably as she stepped inside. For a moment, she disappeared into the small metallic space. Ethan waited quietly. A few seconds later, her glowing blue eyes appeared again at the doorway. She looked around the valley, then up at the enormous human kneeling nearby. Her expression had changed again. This time it carried something new. Wonder. "This is the first time a human has built something for my people," she said softly. Ethan smiled in the gentle, slightly awkward way humans often did when someone treated a simple act as something extraordinary. Well, he replied, glancing at the small shelter glowing in the alien sunlight. Everyone has to start somewhere. The humming crystal trees echoed faintly through the valley as the tiny structure stood between them, a small symbol of trust growing in the wide, quiet world. The afternoon wind began to move across the valley in long, quiet waves, bending the glowing branches of the crystal trees and sending faint musical tones drifting through the warm air. Ethan Cole leaned back on one hand beside the landing ramp of his shuttle, watching the tiny shelter he had built from scraps of metal and transparent shielding. The structure looked almost comically small compared to the equipment scattered around the camp, yet it stood firmly against the gentle wind. Inside the narrow opening, Luma stepped out slowly and spread her wings to their full width for the first time since Ethan had seen her. The delicate structures shimmered with thin veins of pale blue light, catching the sunlight like living glass. She hovered briefly in the air, rising only a few inches above the ground before settling again beside the entrance of the shelter. Ethan could not help smiling at the sight. "Looks like it fits," he said. Luma nodded once, glancing back at the tiny structure. "It is stronger than the shelters my people weave during travel," she admitted. "And it does not move when the wind changes." Ethan brushed a bit of silver dust off his sleeve. "Engineering advantage," he replied casually. Luma folded her wings behind her again and walked a short distance toward the toe of his boot, studying the enormous shape with thoughtful curiosity rather than fear. The transformation in her expression was subtle but unmistakable. The terror that had filled her voice earlier had faded into cautious interest. After a moment, she looked up again and asked the question that had clearly been growing in her mind for some time. "Why do you help something smaller than your food?" Ethan blinked once at the phrasing. He thought about the question for a few seconds, watching the sunlight ripple across the valley floor. The answer that came to him felt simple, but he knew from her expression that it would sound strange to her world. "Because I can," he said calmly. Luma tilted her head. "That is not a logical reason." Ethan shrugged lightly. "Maybe not where you come from." She considered that. "Among my people, power is used carefully," she explained. "The larger protect the larger. The smaller protect the smaller. Balance keeps everyone alive." Ethan nodded slowly, appreciating the idea even if it felt different from human instinct. "That sounds like a pretty organized system," he said. "It works," Luma replied. "But it also means no one protects something weaker than themselves." Ethan looked down at the tiny alien standing beside his boot, and then out across the endless valley stretching beyond the camp. The warm wind brushed across his face as the distant crystal trees continued their soft humming song. Finally he spoke again, his voice quiet but steady. "Where humans come from," he said, "being bigger usually means you are responsible for more than yourself." Luma watched him closely, clearly trying to measure the truth behind his words. "Responsible," she repeated slowly. Ethan nodded. "Yes, responsible." She turned slightly and glanced back at the small shelter again, its metallic sides reflecting thin bands of light. For several seconds she said nothing. The breeze grew a little stronger, tugging gently at the edges of Ethan's jacket and rustling the strange glowing leaves around the camp. Finally Luma looked up at him again, her voice softer than before. "Then humans are stranger than our stories ever imagined," she said. Ethan laughed quietly. "You are probably right about that." For the first time since she had appeared beneath the rock that morning, Luma stepped forward without hesitation until she stood only an inch away from the edge of Ethan's boot. From her point of view, it was still an enormous distance. From Ethan's point of view, it was the clearest sign, yet that trust had begun to take root in the quiet valley between a human explorer and a traveler from a world no map had ever recorded. The afternoon light slowly shifted across the valley, stretching long golden reflections along the smooth silver dust surrounding Ethan Cole's small research camp. The gentle humming from the crystal trees continued in the distance, rising and falling like a quiet melody carried by the wind. Ethan remained seated beside the landing ramp, resting his arms loosely across his knees while observing the tiny shelter he had built earlier. From time to time his eyes drifted toward the small glowing figure standing near his boot. Luma seemed far more relaxed now than when the day had begun. She walked slowly across the dusty ground, examining the strange landscape of human equipment around her with growing fascination. Every object in the camp must have appeared enormous from her perspective. The edge of a metal crate rose like a cliff wall. The folded tripod of a survey scanner resembled a towering metal forest. Even the shallow tread patterns in Ethan's boots formed valleys and ridges across the dust. Luma paused beside one of those boot impressions and studied it thoughtfully before glancing up again toward Ethan. "Your steps reshape the ground," she said quietly. Ethan followed her gaze and smiled faintly. "That tends to happen when you weigh about 180 pounds on a low-gravity world." Luma nodded slowly, absorbing the unfamiliar measurement. "That is very large." Ethan chuckled softly. "I suppose it is from your point of view." The wind shifted again, slightly stronger than before. The crystal leaves overhead rattled gently, sending brighter notes through the humming sound that echoed across the valley. Luma lifted her head, as if sensing something beyond the camp. Her wings twitched once. Ethan noticed the change immediately. "Everything all right?" he asked. Luma remained still for a moment, listening carefully. The wind moved through the distant ridges again. Then she spoke quietly. "Something is moving out there." Ethan turned his head toward the open valley beyond the line of glowing trees. At first he saw nothing unusual. The landscape remained calm, shimmering under the afternoon sun. But then a faint ripple passed through the tall silver grasses farther down the slope, as if something unseen had moved between them. Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly. "Probably just local wildlife," he said calmly. Luma did not look convinced. She stepped backward toward the small shelter, her wings tightening close to her back again. "Creatures here follow scent and movement," she explained softly. "They investigate anything unfamiliar." Ethan nodded slowly as he considered that. Frontier planets always held surprises, and this world had not yet been fully mapped. He reached down beside the ramp and picked up a small handheld scanner from his toolkit. The device hummed quietly as he activated it, sweeping a gentle blue arc across the valley floor. The display blinked with a few scattered signals from plant life and distant airborne organisms. Nothing large appeared on the sensor grid. Ethan relaxed slightly and lowered the scanner again. "Looks clear," he said. Luma watched the scanner with open curiosity. "Your machines can see things you cannot." Ethan nodded. "Sometimes." She studied the device for a moment longer, then slowly stepped away from the shelter again. The tension in her wings eased as the valley remained peaceful. The rippling grass far away settled back into stillness under the warm sunlight. Ethan placed the scanner beside him again and leaned back comfortably. "False alarm," he said with a quiet smile. Luma looked around the calm valley once more before nodding. "Perhaps." She turned her glowing blue eyes back toward Ethan and added thoughtfully, "Still, it is reassuring that the giant nearby seems determined to keep watch." Ethan laughed softly at that description. "I guess I am the neighborhood giant now." Luma's wings shimmered briefly in the sunlight as she stepped closer again, no longer retreating toward the shelter. The strange, quiet friendship that had begun only hours earlier continued to grow beneath the endless sky of the alien world, where a human explorer and a tiny traveler now shared the same patch of dust beneath the humming crystal trees. The valley remained peaceful for several long minutes after the distant movement in the silver grass had faded away. The afternoon sun now hung lower in the sky, casting warmer amber light across Ethan Cole's small research camp. The crystal trees surrounding the clearing shimmered softly as the breeze passed through them, their humming tones rising and falling like the slow breathing of the planet itself. Ethan leaned back against the landing ramp of his shuttle, relaxed but still quietly observant. Years of exploration had taught him that calm landscapes could change quickly, especially on worlds that humans barely understood. Near the edge of his boot print, Luma walked slowly across the dusty ground, examining a small fragment of reflective metal that had fallen from the supply crate earlier. She tilted it toward the sunlight, watching how the beam of light bounced across the ground like a tiny moving star. "Your world must be full of enormous structures," she said thoughtfully. Ethan followed the moving flash of reflected light and smiled. "Some of them are pretty big, yes." Luma nodded. "If everything on your world is built at your scale, the cities must look like mountains." Ethan considered that image and laughed quietly. "You are not entirely wrong." The breeze shifted again, but this time the movement across the valley carried something different with it. A faint tone, low and distant, rolled across the sky like the echo of a deep bell. Ethan lifted his head immediately. That sound had not come from the crystal trees. Luma froze where she stood. Her wings spread slightly as she turned toward the horizon beyond the glowing forest. The tone came again, clearer now, accompanied by a distant shimmer of light high above the valley. Ethan slowly stood to his feet and shaded his eyes with one hand while looking toward the sky. At first, the brightness of the afternoon sun made it difficult to see clearly. Then a small shape appeared far above the cloudless horizon, gliding silently through the upper atmosphere. It moved with smooth precision, leaving faint trails of blue light that dissolved quickly in the warm air. Ethan lowered his hand slightly, studying the object with focused attention. "That is definitely not local wildlife," he said quietly. Luma stared upward, her glowing eyes widening. "That is one of ours." Ethan glanced down toward her. "Your people travel in ships?" Luma nodded slowly without looking away from the sky. "Yes, but they were not supposed to find me here so quickly." The distant craft continued descending through the atmosphere, its shape becoming clearer against the golden sky. It was long and elegant, like a curved shard of glass reflecting the sun. Thin arcs of blue energy pulsed along its surface as it adjusted its descent. Ethan watched the ship carefully, his explorer's instincts already shifting into observation mode. "Friend or problem?" he asked calmly. Luma hesitated before answering. "Both, perhaps." The ship slowed high above the valley, hovering silently for a moment as if scanning the ground below. The humming crystal trees beneath it vibrated slightly in response to the faint energy field surrounding the vessel. Ethan folded his arms loosely across his chest while studying the sky. "Looks like they are searching for something," he said. Luma finally turned her gaze down toward him. The uncertainty in her expression had returned, but it was different from the fear she had shown earlier. This time it carried something closer to responsibility. "They are searching for me," she said quietly. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You must be pretty important." Luma remained silent for a moment as the ship continued hovering above the valley, its faint blue glow shimmering across the landscape. Finally, she spoke again in a voice softer than the wind. "I am not simply a traveler from my people," she said. "I am the daughter of the queen." Ethan looked back toward the sky where the elegant vessel waited above the crystal forest, then down at the tiny glowing figure standing beside his boot. A slow smile crossed his face. "Well," he said calmly, "that certainly explains the search party." The ship's soft blue light washed gently across the valley as the quiet world prepared for a meeting neither species had expected that morning. The elegant vessel hovered silently above the valley like a fragment of blue starlight caught in the afternoon sky. Its smooth curved surface reflected the golden glow of the sun, while thin rings of energy pulsed gently along its edges. Ethan Cole stood beside his shuttle with his arms loosely folded, watching the craft with the quiet curiosity of someone who had spent years exploring unfamiliar worlds. At his feet, Luma remained still in the silver dust, her glowing wings half unfolded as she stared upward. For several long seconds the ship simply remained there, suspended high above the humming crystal trees. Then a narrow beam of soft blue light extended downward through the open air, sweeping slowly across the valley floor. The light passed over Ethan's shuttle, over the scattered supply crates, and finally over the small shelter he had built beside the landing ramp. When the beam reached the ground near Ethan's boot, it paused. Luma looked up at the light, and her wings shimmered faintly, as if responding to it. Ethan glanced down at her. "I am guessing that is your ride home," he said calmly. Luma nodded once, though her eyes remained fixed on the hovering ship. "They have found me." The beam brightened slightly, forming a gentle column of blue light that reached the ground like a quiet invitation. Ethan stepped back a half step to give the tiny alien more space. "Looks like they are calling you." Luma did not move immediately. Instead, she turned and looked across the small camp one more time. Her eyes passed over the metallic shelter, the landing ramp, and finally the enormous human standing beside it. When she spoke again, her voice carried none of the fear that had filled it earlier that morning. "My people believed humans were monsters," she said quietly. Ethan shrugged lightly. "Some of us probably look that way from a distance." Luma shook her head gently. "No," she said. "Monsters destroy things smaller than themselves." She looked back at the small shelter he had built. "You protected something smaller." Ethan smiled faintly at that, though he did not say anything. The beam of light continued glowing softly beside them. Luma stepped forward and stood at the edge of it. The blue glow wrapped around her wings like mist catching sunlight. For a moment she hesitated, then she turned back, toward Ethan one last time. From her perspective, he still looked enormous, a giant figure standing against the wide sky of an unfamiliar world. But now there was no fear in her eyes, only understanding. When my mother asks what I learned beyond our borders, Luma said softly, I will tell her something important. Ethan raised an eyebrow with mild curiosity. And what is that? Luma's wings spread gently as the light began lifting her slowly upward. Her final words drifted down through the quiet air of the valley. Humans are terrifying, she said with a small glowing smile. But their kindness is even stronger. The beam carried her upward toward the waiting ship, which glowed brighter for a moment before rising smoothly back toward the open sky. Ethan watched the vessel ascend, until it became a distant shimmer of blue light above the crystal ridges. The valley slowly returned to its peaceful silence. The humming trees continued their quiet music in the wind, and the tiny shelter still stood beside the landing ramp where the sunlight touched its metallic walls. Ethan finally exhaled and looked down at the empty patch of silver dust near his boot. He smiled to himself and said softly, Safe travels, princess. Then he turned back toward his workbench as the alien sun continued its slow journey across the sky.